was a nurse that night. The night they brought in the man they said was Tupac. But here's the shocking truth. There were no gunshot wounds. Not a single one. The whole story didn't add up, and something much darker was at play. I kept quiet for years, but now I need to tell you what really happened that night. What I discovered and what I was forced to hide will change everything you think you know. Stick with me, because this is a truth that's been buried too long. It was late when they brought him in, around midnight, just as the hospital was settling into that eerie, quiet lull. Most of the ER staff had already started to wind down for the night. You know the shift. That one where the silence is almost too heavy and the clock ticks louder than normal. I was ready for the night to end, but then they rushed in. They didn't need to say who it was. I could hear it in their voices, the tension, the urgency. "It's Tupac," one of the paramedics said as they wheeled him through the ER doors. But when they moved him to the bed and pulled back the sheet, that's when my heart skipped a beat. I froze. The man in front of me didn't look like the Tupac I'd seen in photos. Not the strong, vibrant celebrity who'd been plastered on magazine covers. This man, this patient, looked broken. But not broken in the way you'd expect someone who'd been shot multiple times. There were no gunshot wounds. I checked twice. Not a single bullet hole, not a trace of blood that would have been there had he been shot. I was used to seeing trauma cases, especially in the ER, and I knew what to expect when someone had been shot at close range. The blood, the burn marks, the entry wounds, everything that comes with it. But this was nothing like I'd ever seen before. The rest of the medical team rushed in around me. There were the usual whispers, but no one seemed to question the obvious discrepancy. No one seemed concerned. The way they moved, the way they talked, it was all so controlled. The urgency felt rehearsed. The man who claimed to be Tupac was unconscious, but nothing about the situation felt real. I felt it deep in my bones. The danger of this moment was bigger than just one celebrity. I moved through my routine like I always did. Checked his vitals, took his temperature, even performed a quick neurological assessment. But the entire time, something gnawed at me. This wasn't right. The man they said was Tupac was in front of me, but he didn't match the story. There was no blood, no signs of trauma. Just a man in deep, unconscious sleep, surrounded by a team that seemed more concerned with keeping things quiet than saving his life. What bothered me more was the urgency behind the scene. There was an energy in the room, an undercurrent of control that made me uneasy. The security presence was heavier than usual. The higher-ups in the hospital were buzzing in and out of the room. And the police. They stood at the edge of the hallway, waiting but not intervening. They weren't here to ask questions. They were here to keep things moving. I had seen my share of celebrity cases before, but nothing like this. They always had security, of course, but this felt different. There was no room for error, no room for questions. Everything had been arranged before he even stepped through those doors, and that's when I knew. This wasn't just an emergency. This was a performance, a carefully constructed plan that I was now a part of, whether I liked it or not. I had to look away for a second to shake the feeling off. I went back to my work, pretending like everything was fine. But something inside me couldn't ignore the unsettling truth. Something about this patient, this so-called Tupac, didn't add up. But this was just the beginning. And what I was about to learn would make me question everything I thought I knew. I stood there, feeling my pulse quicken as I began my initial assessment. The patient, the man they had rushed in claiming to be Tupac, was unconscious. But that was all they could tell me. He was in critical condition, or so they said. But as I examined him, I realized that nothing about his condition lined up with the story I was being told. I had seen my share of trauma cases, enough to know the signs of a gunshot wound. I knew the drill: multiple entry points, blood, burns from the gunpowder residue, the telltale signs that made it obvious. But as I checked, I found nothing. No gunshot wounds, no blood stains, not a single mark on his body. I even ran my fingers over his skin, hoping to find something, anything, that would suggest the injuries I'd been briefed on. But there was nothing. I moved through my standard procedures, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. The team moved quickly, but no one seemed concerned by the fact that the patient appeared to have sustained no physical trauma, despite what we'd been told. I looked at the paramedics who'd brought him in, but they just stood there, looking as if everything was normal. But nothing about this felt normal. The patient had been shot, they said, but there wasn't a single bullet wound on him. How could a man be shot multiple times and have no visible wounds? I ran through the possibilities in my head. Maybe the wounds were hidden. Maybe the bleeding had stopped. Maybe there was something I missed. But as I continued my assessment, it became clear. Nothing about this added up. There was no blood splatter, no entry wounds, no exit wounds, and not a single trace of a gunshot wound anywhere on his body. How could this be? It didn't make sense. Everything I'd been told, everything I was supposed to expect was just gone. No evidence of a shooting, just a man lying on a gurney, unconscious, with no visible injuries to explain his condition. I kept thinking back to the paramedics. How did they bring him in here? What did they see? Did they know more than they were letting on? Was I being made to believe a story that didn't match reality? I stood there, frozen, for longer than I care to admit. The more I looked at him, the more questions began to flood my mind. I tried to push those thoughts aside, telling myself to focus on the task at hand. But how could I? The longer I stared at him, the more surreal the situation became. This wasn't just another celebrity emergency. This was something else entirely. Something darker. As I stood over the patient, I couldn't help but feel like I was part of some twisted story. Like I had somehow been sucked into a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. How could they be so sure it was Tupac if he wasn't even hurt? Why wasn't anyone else questioning it? As I checked his vitals again, I found myself wishing for some kind of clue, anything that could explain what was happening here. But everything checked out. His heart rate was stable, his breathing even. Everything that should have indicated severe trauma, shock, rapid heart rate, irregular breathing, was absent. It was as if he was just asleep. No signs of a gunshot wound, no trauma. I started to ask myself, what am I missing? Was I the only one seeing this? The whole situation felt like a dream I couldn't wake up from. I kept looking for the signs of injury, hoping I'd missed something, but every time I examined him, I came up empty. The patient wasn't just uninjured. He was perfect. Too perfect. I stepped back for a moment, trying to get a clearer view of the situation, but my mind was racing. I had seen victims of gunshot wounds before. They were never just fine. There were always signs: blood, damage, trauma. But this, it was as if it never happened. And that was when the fear started to sink in. I was part of something bigger than just a simple emergency. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces didn't fit. There was a story here, but I wasn't sure it was the one I was being told. What if this was all part of something more sinister? What if I was being played, led down a path to believe something that wasn't true? Was this a mistake, a misidentification, or was there something else at work here? I realized then that I had no control over what was happening. I was just a nurse, doing my job, but the moment I started to question the truth, I became part of the cover-up. There was no escaping it. I had already started to ask questions no one else was asking, and I wasn't sure where that would take me. What if I was wrong? What if this was all just an accident and I was overthinking it? The fear of being silenced started to creep in. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't control. But deep down, I knew one thing for sure. This patient wasn't who they said he was. And that fact alone sent a chill down my spine. But as the tension rises, something much darker begins to unfold. I was about to uncover something that would change everything I thought I knew. It wasn't long before I started noticing things that didn't make sense. It wasn't just the patient. It was everything around him. The whole situation felt off in a way I couldn't put into words. I had treated enough high-profile patients to know that there's a certain protocol, a certain way things are done. But what I was seeing now was different. It was as if the entire hospital had been transformed into a closed-off, tightly controlled environment. As soon as they wheeled the man into the room, the doors were locked. There was an unusual amount of security at the entrances, more than I had ever seen, even for the most well-known celebrities. Nurses and doctors were whispering in corners, talking in hushed tones. It was like a stage, and I was just an extra, hoping not to mess up my lines. The higher-ups were moving like clockwork, checking in every few minutes. I could see them through the observation windows in the hall, hovering near the door, watching over everything like they were waiting for something to happen. But what? The urgency in their eyes didn't match the condition of the patient. There was no reason to act this way, yet here they were, anxious, controlled, preparing for something. I was supposed to be focused on my patient, but there was a growing unease in the pit of my stomach. The man lying there wasn't just anyone. This was Tupac, supposedly. But he didn't look like the Tupac I'd seen in the media. The man before me seemed altered. He had no visible injuries, no signs of a gunshot wound, but they had assured us he was brought in because of a shooting. Number. This wasn't adding up. Something much deeper was happening here. The doctors were treating him like any other patient, but it was clear that their focus wasn't on his recovery. It was on something else. I noticed the way they worked in silence, moving as if they already knew the outcome. The sterile routine felt rehearsed, like we were all part of a play, and everyone knew their role except for me. It was as though the only thing that mattered was keeping up appearances. Nothing could go wrong. Everything had to be perfect. I kept trying to brush off the feeling I had a job to do. So I did it. I checked vitals, took blood samples, started the IV, but the more I did, the more I felt like I was doing nothing but playing my part in a much bigger, more sinister production. No one was really asking questions. Everyone just kept moving, like clockwork. No one noticed how out of place I was, how uncomfortable I felt in this preordained world. As I walked around the room, making sure everything was in order, I couldn't help but notice the tension in the air. The hospital was being transformed before my eyes. This wasn't the usual chaos of a busy ER. It was different. The walls seemed to close in on me as I went from one task to the next, trying to keep my mind occupied. I could feel eyes on me at all times, like someone was waiting for me to slip up. The door was barely cracked open when I saw a hospital administrator pass by, glancing into the room. It wasn't normal to have the higher-ups showing up in a situation like this. They didn't need to be here. The patient wasn't in critical condition. What were they so worried about? The strangest part was the lack of communication. Normally, if a celebrity or high-profile individual was admitted, the hospital would be buzzing with calls, emails, questions. But not this time. It was quiet, unnervingly so. And that's when I realized no one was asking questions. Everyone was just following the script, and I was the only one who seemed to notice that something was terribly wrong. The nurse assigned to the room was the same. Calm, collected, acting like this was just another night. But she wasn't asking questions either. It was like she had already accepted that everything was exactly as it should be. The only person who seemed uneasy was me. I began to wonder if they knew something I didn't, or maybe they had already been told what was going to happen. The unease only grew, especially when I realized how quickly things were moving. Why were they so sure that the situation was under control? What were they hiding? Later that night, when I had a moment to myself, I stepped into the hallway, trying to clear my head. I overheard a conversation between two of the senior staff. One of them said, "We can't afford any mistakes tonight." Not with this one. The way they spoke, cold, calculated, like it was all part of the plan, hit me like a punch to the stomach. What did they mean? What was going to happen tonight? And why was I the only one who seemed to be asking questions? My hands started to shake as I leaned against the wall. I needed to understand what was happening. But every time I got close, something pulled me back. I felt like I was about to cross some invisible line I couldn't come back from. As the night dragged on, the hospital became even more locked down. A team of security guards arrived, moving through the hallways like they owned the place. They stopped by the room, looking through the glass window at the patient. They didn't seem concerned. But why the security? Why the extra caution? That was the moment it hit me. I wasn't just a nurse here. I wasn't just doing my job. I was a part of something I couldn't even begin to understand. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to anymore. What I was starting to suspect was terrifying. But I had no idea that what I would discover next would change everything. The more I tried to shake off the strange feelings from that night, the more they clung to me. I thought I was imagining things at first. After all, I had been through some wild cases, high-stress moments in the ER. But there was something different about this one. Every day that passed felt like I was sinking deeper into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I couldn't stop thinking about the patient they said was Tupac. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face again. The face that didn't match the man I had seen in the media. The hospital staff, the security, the higher-ups who never seemed to leave the building. It was all starting to feel like I was caught in something far bigger than I was capable of understanding. The more I replayed the events in my mind, the more the pieces didn't add up. The man wasn't in critical condition. Yet, they were treating him like he was the most important person in the world. The doctors, nurses, everyone, moving quickly, deliberately, as if they were following a script. And then there was me, stuck in the middle, not knowing whether to speak up or stay quiet. By the third day, the unease had become unbearable. I found myself double-checking everything. I was going through the motions, but something felt off, almost like I was being watched. Every time I stepped into the room, I felt eyes on me. Not just the usual staff keeping tabs kind of feeling, but something deeper. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I look over my shoulder as if I expected someone to be right there, listening, but no one was. Or at least, that's what I told myself. I couldn't ignore the whispers anymore. The staff, the doctors, the way they all moved. It wasn't normal. It wasn't casual. They were acting like they knew exactly what would happen next. I overheard a conversation between two doctors one morning. It was brief, but unsettling. They were talking about the timing of things and how certain details needed to stay under wraps. They weren't talking about his condition. They weren't even talking about the patient's health. It was all about the plan. And then, the words that stuck with me. Make sure this is handled quietly. The feeling in my gut intensified. I couldn't let it go. I started looking through the patient's charts when I had the chance. His vital signs. Perfectly fine, no signs of anything serious. His medical history. Nothing out of the ordinary. I'd seen more critical cases. Cases where the patient's life hung by a thread. And yet this one? They were treating him like a prince in his deathbed. But why? What was the urgency? Why was there so much control? Then, one evening, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. I was walking past the ICU when I noticed a group of people standing outside the room talking in hushed tones. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but something made me stop. One of them, a high-ranking administrator, said, "We need to move forward with the next phase. There's no turning back." Now, another voice responded, "Understood, but we can't risk anyone else finding out. Not yet, not until it's time." I froze. What were they talking about? It wasn't just about the patient anymore. It was about something else. My head was spinning. My heart was racing. I had to leave. I couldn't breathe, but the words wouldn't leave my mind. We can't risk anyone finding out. What were they hiding? The fear was starting to take hold of me now. I had been warned by my colleagues before to keep my head down. This wasn't the time to ask questions, they told me. The hospital was too big, too connected. If I made a scene, if I stepped out of line, I could lose everything. My job, my reputation, my career. I had everything to lose. So, I pushed the nagging questions aside, convincing myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe I was overthinking it all. But that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had overheard. What was the next phase? Why were they so determined to keep everything quiet? I had to know. I needed to find out. But every time I felt like I was getting close, something pulled me back. The next day, I got a phone call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was calm. Too calm. "We know you're asking questions. We don't want to have to make this a problem. You're a nurse. You know your place. Keep your head down and nothing will happen. You don't want to find out what happens if you don't." It was a threat. No doubt about it. I felt my blood run cold. I had always been the kind of person to stand up for what was right, to ask questions when things didn't make sense. But this was a different level. I wasn't just a nurse anymore. I was a liability. The next few days were a blur. I tried to focus on my work, but every time I stepped into that room, every time I passed one of the security guards standing in the hallways, I felt like I was suffocating. There were cameras everywhere. I started to feel trapped, like a rat in a cage. But that's when I realized this wasn't just about me. This was bigger. This wasn't just about a patient or a celebrity in need of care. This was about a story being told, a story that had already been written, and I was just a small part of it. I didn't know where this was leading, but I knew I couldn't walk away from it. Not anymore. What I didn't know was that this was just the beginning of my nightmare. The truth was darker than I ever could have imagined. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Every night after my shift, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was the only one who could see it. Every day at the hospital, it felt like I was moving in a fog, surrounded by people who were either oblivious or complicit. No one was talking about what was really happening. The patient, the so-called Tupac, had been with us for days now, but the doctors weren't talking about his recovery. They were talking about the plan, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. One night, after everyone had left, I snuck into the medical records room. I had to see the charts for myself. I had already begun noticing discrepancies between what I was being told and what I saw. The initial reports of the gunshots, the supposed trauma, the state of the patient. It didn't match what I'd observed. I needed to know more. I walked into the records room, the fluorescent lights flickering above me. The door creaked as I closed it quietly behind me. I knew I had to be quick. There were only a few minutes before the late shift would start to look for me. My hand shook as I flipped through the charts. As expected, the official reports didn't add up. The medical team had given him painkillers for gunshot wounds, but there were no wounds. The wounds should have been marked in the charts, but there was nothing. No sign of blood loss, no signs of trauma. I froze. What was I missing? I dug deeper into the records, scrolling through the patient's history, trying to connect the dots. But the further I looked, the more confused I became. Everything seemed too clean, too perfect. It didn't make sense. The reports were too polished, too rehearsed. And I realized then there was no mistake. This wasn't an error. This was intentional. Everything had been engineered to look a certain way, to mislead anyone who might question it. The noise of the hallway outside pulled me out of my trance. My heart hammered in my chest. Someone was coming. I grabbed the charts and shoved them back into the drawer, not bothering to cover my tracks. I darted for the exit, slipping out of the room just as a nurse walked by. She didn't even notice me. I returned to my station, my mind racing. What did I know? What was I supposed to do with the truth I had found? As the shift wore on, I kept glancing at the door to the patient's room. Every time I walked by, I felt the weight of the secrecy pressing down on me. But the fear wasn't just about losing my job. It was about what might happen to me if I dug too deep. They were already watching me. I could feel it in the way the security guards stood at attention when I walked past, the way the nurses acted like they knew I was on the verge of cracking. That night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get answers. I couldn't just ignore what was happening. I was a part of this, and whether I liked it or not, I needed to know the truth. So I did what any terrified, confused person would do. I called someone. I reached out to an old friend, someone who had worked in the system for years. They were someone I could trust. At least I thought I could trust them. I met them at a coffee shop a few blocks from the hospital. They were nervous when they sat down. Their eyes darted around like they were afraid someone would overhear us. "I don't know how you got my number," they whispered, "but you need to stop looking into this. It's bigger than you think." The words hit me like a punch. "Bigger than I think," I repeated. "What's going on? I have a right to know what's happening. This isn't normal." They looked over their shoulder before speaking again. "You're not the only one who's been noticing things. People have been talking, but no one dares to speak up. They're too powerful. This isn't about Tupac. This is about controlling a story that needs to be told a certain way." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "A story?" I asked, feeling the hairs on my neck stand up. "They're trying to manipulate the public. This whole thing, it's about more than just keeping him alive. It's about managing what people know, and someone in the hospital is making sure everything goes according to plan. This isn't just a case of mistaken identity or a botched shooting. This is something they're orchestrating, and you don't want to get in the way." The words sent shockwaves through me. What was I involved in? This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. It was an entire fabricated narrative, a manufactured event designed to keep people in the dark. But who was behind it? And why was Tupac involved in the first place? I barely heard what they said next. All I could think about was what I had learned. This was a cover-up, an elaborate, dangerous cover-up. And I was smack in the middle of it, unknowingly helping to perpetuate the lie. I returned to the hospital that night, my mind a whirlpool of confusion and dread. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't turn back. The truth was out there, and I was getting closer to it with every step I took. But the more I uncovered, the more I realized how far this went, and how much danger I was in. I had made the mistake of trusting the system, of thinking that everything I was doing was right. But now I saw the strings being pulled behind the scenes. This was bigger than just one patient. It was a conspiracy to control a narrative, to manipulate the truth. And I was stuck in the middle of it. But just when I thought I understood the truth, something even darker would be revealed. Something that would shake me to my core. By now, the weight of everything I had uncovered was suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pulled deeper into something far darker than I had ever imagined. It wasn't just about one patient. It wasn't even about Tupac. No, this was bigger. There were people behind this, orchestrating it all. The story, the secrecy, the control. Everything was planned. And I was right in the middle of it, just one step away from seeing the full picture. The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. The more I realized how carefully everything had been managed. The hospital, the staff, the security. It was all part of a web of control that stretched far beyond the walls of the ER. Whoever was behind this wasn't just manipulating the narrative of a celebrity's death. They were controlling everything. From the moment the patient arrived at the hospital, everything had been calculated. There were no accidents here, no random events. Every step was part of a larger plan. The more I looked into it, the more disturbing it became. The hospital records were flawless, too flawless. There were no discrepancies, no mistakes. It was as if someone had scrubbed everything clean. But what was even more unsettling was how easy it had been to erase the truth. The higher-ups had made sure that no one questioned anything. Everyone who worked at the hospital followed the script, keeping their heads down, doing their jobs. But it was becoming clearer to me now. No one was actually doing their job. They were just following orders. They were all complicit. I decided to take things into my own hands. I couldn't keep ignoring the warning signs. I started to dig deeper, beyond the patient's file, beyond the surface of what was happening in that sterile, controlled world. I reached out to a few trusted colleagues, ones who had been there longer than I had. I started asking questions, trying to get them to tell me what was really going on. But each time I did, I was met with silence. Cold, hard silence. People didn't want to talk. They didn't want to know the truth. One evening, as I was walking through the halls, I overheard something that made my heart stop. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but I couldn't help it. I heard a conversation between two doctors speaking in low, hushed voices. "We need to move forward with the plan," one of them said. "The public will believe whatever we tell them. They always do." The other doctor responded, "I just hope we don't have to push things too far. We're already taking a big risk here." That was it. The plan. What plan? I had heard whispers of a plan before, but this time it was too much. This wasn't just about Tupac. This was a carefully constructed lie, a narrative that they wanted to control from the inside out. They weren't just trying to cover up an incident. They were trying to redefine the truth. They wanted the public to believe what they wanted them to believe, no matter the cost. And I was standing right in the middle of it, too afraid to speak up, but too curious to back down. The fear of what would happen if I uncovered the truth started to grip me like a vice. I had never been in a situation like this before. I had never seen so many people so willing to ignore the obvious, to bury the truth because it was easier. I didn't know if I could trust anyone. No one was talking. Everyone had their part to play, and I realized that my part was to keep my mouth shut. But I couldn't. I couldn't just sit by and let this unfold, not when I knew something was wrong. That night, I stayed up late, going through the records again. I couldn't help myself. I had to know more. But there was nothing new. No new information. No shocking revelations. Just the same clean reports. The same tidy narrative. It felt like I was chasing something that didn't exist. But deep down, I knew I was getting closer. I could feel it. Whatever was going on here, whatever conspiracy was being spun, it was beginning to unravel at the edges. I just needed to push a little further, dig a little deeper, and then I received a message. It was a text, one I wasn't expecting. It simply read, "Stop. You're getting too close." I knew instantly that I wasn't imagining things. This wasn't just about a patient who didn't have gunshot wounds. This was something far more dangerous. Someone wanted to keep me silent. But who? And why? The walls were closing in. The further I pushed, the more dangerous it became. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep going before the truth consumed me completely. But now, there was no turning back. I had already crossed the line, and I couldn't unsee what I had seen. The conspiracy was real. and the danger was closer than I ever realized. But I didn't know it yet. The true horror was still ahead. The real story behind Tupac's death was darker than I could ever imagine. By the time I received that message, I knew there was no going back. I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. My mind was reeling. Who was watching me? And why now? Was it because I was getting too close to the truth? The fear hit me hard. I could feel it deep in my chest, like a weight I couldn't escape. Someone wanted to stop me, and they weren't going to let me keep digging without consequences. I had no choice but to move forward. If I stopped now, if I walked away from this, I knew I'd never forgive myself. The lies, the cover-up, the manipulation, it had all been building up to this moment. But I wasn't just scared of losing my job anymore. Now, I was scared for my safety. I didn't know who I could trust, but I couldn't live in fear. Not when I was so close to unraveling everything. The hospital had become a prison for me, and I was its unwilling inmate. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me. Staff, security, even the patients. I tried to keep my head down, do my job, but the paranoia was too much. I knew I wasn't just some nurse on the front lines anymore. I was part of something much bigger, something I couldn't outrun. That's when I started noticing the strange phone calls. Late at night, after my shift, I'd hear the ring of my phone. But when I picked up, there was no one on the other end. The line was silent. The air seemed to thicken with every call, and I began to wonder if they were trying to send me a message, or worse, watching me. It wasn't long before I found the first real clue that I was in over my head. One evening, while going through patient files, something I had done hundreds of times before, I came across something unusual. It wasn't in the records, but an internal memo that had been hidden deep within the system. It wasn't meant for my eyes, but it was there. And the words hit me like a punch. The narrative must be controlled. Nothing can leak out. The public cannot know the truth. I froze, reading those words over and over again. The narrative? What was this? Was this about Tupac? Or was this about something bigger than just him? It was clear now. This wasn't just about a celebrity or a fake shooting. This was about controlling what the public believed, about keeping the truth buried at all costs. And someone, somewhere, was pulling the strings, making sure it stayed hidden. But who? I didn't know who to trust anymore. The message from earlier had already shaken me. They didn't want me to dig, but I had to know what was being covered up. I had already come too far to back down. I had one last move. I needed to find someone on the inside who knew the full extent of what was going on. I couldn't do this alone. I decided to reach out to a colleague I trusted, someone I had worked with in the past. They had always been straight with me. And maybe, just maybe, they knew something more than I did. I met them in the usual place, a dimly lit coffee shop a few miles from the hospital. They looked nervous, almost like they'd been expecting me. When I sat down, they didn't waste time. "Stop. You're getting in too deep," they said, their voice barely above a whisper. "They'll make sure you're silenced if you keep going. It's not just the hospital anymore. It's bigger than you think. It goes all the way to the top." The words sent a chill through me. What did they mean by the top? Who was behind this? What was really happening? "You're not just fighting the hospital system," my colleague continued, glancing nervously around. You're going up against people who don't play by the rules. People who control everything, from the media to the public's perception. You've already seen the plan, haven't you? You've been living it. I nodded. Every moment of the last few days flashed before my eyes. The secrecy, the control, the manipulation. It was all part of the bigger picture. But what was the real reason behind it? My colleague leaned in closer. This wasn't just about Tupac. The patient, that patient, was a decoy, a part of a larger game. His death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a way to control the narrative, and you're standing in the middle of it. I felt the ground shift beneath me. The conspiracy went beyond a simple cover-up. This was about manipulating the public, controlling a story that wasn't supposed to be questioned. It wasn't just about keeping Tupac alive. It was about creating a narrative they could control and maintain. I left that meeting shaken, more terrified than I had ever been. I was no longer just a witness to this madness. I was caught in the web, a player in a game I didn't even understand. They weren't going to stop, not unless I stayed quiet. And if I didn't know what would happen. But I had already made my decision. The truth needed to be exposed. It didn't matter what it cost me anymore. But little did I know, my fight for the truth would cost me more than I was ready for. What was about to happen next would be more dangerous than I could ever imagine. Final payoff. The truth is, the patient that night wasn't Tupac. The whole thing was a cover-up, a deliberate manipulation of the public's perception. Tupac's death wasn't a random tragedy. It was a staged event, part of a larger conspiracy designed to control the narrative and keep the world in the dark. The man in that room wasn't a victim of violence. He was a decoy, a pawn in a game that went far beyond the walls of the hospital. But it wasn't just about the lies I'd uncovered. It was about the people behind them, the ones pulling the strings, making sure no one ever got close to the truth. And as I learned, the cost of knowing too much was far greater than I could have ever imagined. I was just a nurse, but now I knew too much, and there was no turning back.